I am delighted to introduce my good friend Bob Elton, who will talk about the history of hydromatic transmissions. Bob is a board member of this museum, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians, and a key member of the SAE Mobility History Committee. Bob has been fascinated with automatic transmission since he took apart and rebuilt a Powerflight transmission in his 1954 first car, a Chrysler New Yorker. He went to General Motors Institute in 1965 and did his co-op work at Hydramatic division of General Motors. For the next 50 years, Bob worked in many different areas of automotive engineering and design. He worked at all big three automakers, as well as a number of suppliers, including Lear and Johnson Controls. I am currently standing in front of a car that Bob created from scratch and which was featured in this year's Autorama. I hope you enjoyed Bob's talk. Thank you.
I always start these talks. Thank you. I say, how many people got in their car this morning, started the engine, moved the shift lever into drive, and drove away? Is there anybody that didn't? Once in a while, I get a stick shift holdout. Well, that woman in the picture there is about to do something that very few people had ever done before in that 1940 Oldsmobile. She's about to move that shift lever into drive and drive away without having to use a clutch. That was really something special in 1940. And how did it get there? Well, this is a story of a couple of people who were just fixated on making cars easier to drive. Earl Thompson was kind of the leader of that. Those other guys, Beck, OK, Kelly, and those guys, they worked with him. They gradually got onto his team at General Motors. But Thompson went to school, West Coast, worked his way through college driving the President's 1913 Pierce Arrow. Well, those cars, I don't know if you've ever driven a really old car like that. Those cars are really a bear to drive. And shifting gears on an old car like that with straight cut gears and no synchronizers or anything, you really got to know how to do it. It's really a bear. And lots of people have lots of problems doing that. He eventually graduated, became a very successful engineer, owned his own company, did a lot of civil engineering products. But he never got over the fact that cars should be easier to drive. It was just his thing. In the beginning, gasoline cars had a couple of problems that electric cars did not. One was starting the engine. Well, Kettering and others kind of fixed that with the electric starter. But connecting the engine to the wheels, that was a much more complicated engineering problem. I mean, early cars had belts, they had friction drives, cone clutches, disc clutches. And fairly early on, most cars developed a combination of a dry clutch, which is common to stick shift cars these days now, and sliding gear transmission. And it required a lot of skill to operate smoothly without damaging the gears and making terrible noises. Ford, basically Model T Ford, had a planetary transmission which required less driver skill, but it required frequent replacement of the bands and other adjustments and stuff. It wasn't all that satisfactory. The sliding gear transmissions had a wide enough ratio range so that you could get good use out of the power of the engine. But like I say, it still required a lot of skill, those early cars. Well, Thompson worked away at this, and basically he invented the Synchromesh transmission in 1918. 1922, he took a transmission and he came to Detroit from the West Coast, took a train to Detroit, get off, and he goes around and he shows this transmission to all the car companies. There were a lot of car companies back then. And nobody was particularly interested. I mean, basically they all said, our customers aren't asking for a Synchromesh transmission. But of course not, nobody even knew what it was, you know. So he went home and he bought a Cadillac and he put it in a Cadillac. And he drove to Michigan this time and he took it around. It didn't get too much interest until he actually showed up at Cadillac. Cadillac people, Seaholm was the chief engineer. Fisher, the Fisher brothers was running the show by then, and they were pretty impressed. So they bought his patents, and then they hired him to develop it. Cadillac introduced Synchromesh on the 1929 Cadillac cars, and which made a big impression, big success for Cadillac, much easier to drive. That picture is actually a fairly modern picture, but frankly, it's not much different than the Synchromesh that they used in 1929. Basically, minor refinements, still in use. And believe me, without it, driving a stick shift car would be much less pleasant today. So, but it's still, stick shift cars still meant you had to know how to use the clutch. And Thompson thought, that's too much, we got to eliminate the clutch. So they started working on an idea, what they call a roller transmission, toroidal drive, friction drive. And what it was, those funny shaped things, the intermediate wheels would move in relation to the toroidal shapes and give you different ratios. And they worked away on that at Cadillac for a while, Thompson and other guys. But basically, they never got it to really work. And they finally got one that they thought might be plausible. But it weighed 300 pounds. Yeah, and it cost 500 bucks. Well, for 500 bucks, you could have bought a whole Ford by then. In fact, you could have bought a V8 Ford by then. So top management finally said, enough of this. Try something else. So they tried. By then he sort of teamed up with Ralph Beck and Walter Herndon. They were engineers at Cadillac, and Beck knew everything there was to know about planetary gears. Herndon worked with hydraulic controls, mostly in industrial applications to apply bands and clutches and stuff. A little later on, Carnegie and Rosenberger joined the team. Carnegie was an engine expert, and he worked with engines and transmissions, including the V16, which is another engineering coup at Cadillac. Rosenberger was the master of troubleshooting and development at Cadillac. And so together, after a few years, they developed a planetary gear set with hydraulic controls. But other things were happening. In fact, times were really tough in the early 30s. And GM decides, maybe we should just quit making Cadillacs. I mean, shoot, there were some of those Cadillacs that were making onesies and twosies, and all of them, they were making like a tenth as many Cadillacs in 1933 as they did in 1929. And this was pretty serious. You can see why they thought, maybe we should just give up on Cadillac, you know. And don't forget, 1933, people weren't sure that prosperity would ever return, you know, that this was the new normal. So they moved Thompson and all those guys to General Motors Central Engineering, also in Detroit, to keep working on this. They were going to drop the whole project, but Alfred P. Sloan, who was the head guy at General Motors, he thought this was a good idea. He was a terrible driver, and in fact, by then, they insisted they get a chauffeur of 24/7 chauffeurs for this guy. It's too important to be driving around by himself. And and when Alfred P. Sloan thought it was a good idea, obviously lots of other people did too. That's, you know, he was the head guy. Well, 1936, Central Engineering kind of ran out of money. They still didn't really have anything to sell yet. Well, Charles McEwen was the head of Oldsmobile, and he said he thought this was really a good idea to keep working on. And Oldsmobile had the resources to keep these guys working on it. So Thompson and his team, they all moved to Lansing. And they were joined by Oliver Kelly, who was known as O.K. Kelly. He had a thing about fluid couplings and torque converters. And he did a lot of work, hydrodynamic design and stuff. And in the literature, they refer to Kelly's crick. And I didn't know what that was for a while. turns out there was a creek behind his house, and he used to put these blade forms in the creek and watch the water flow around it and stuff. So that's how these things get started. I mean, like I say, he was the kind of guy that was just fascinated by that stuff. Well, they finally came up with what they called the automatic safety transmission. It was creeping up on being an automatic transmission. But what they did was they put in four speed planetary gearbox, had two sets of planetary gears. They still had a set of sliding gears for reverse. And they still had a friction clutch. So you still had to know how to use the clutch to start off, or to put it in reverse. They had used the engine oil to operate the hydraulic control system. And the way this worked was you had to push the clutch down, and you moved the shift lever, had two positions, low and high, and reverse. So you put the shift lever in low, and you let out the clutch, and the car was in low gear by then. And as it sped up a bit, it would shift itself into second. And then you had to move the lever from low to high, which you didn't have to use the clutch for that. You moved the lever from low to high, and it would go into third gear, and eventually go into fourth gear. So it was creeping up on being automatic, but not really quite there yet. And it had a few issues. For one thing, it could be abused by drivers trying to make jackrabbit starts and stuff, and wasn't all that strong. Another problem was they used the engine's oil to operate lubrication and control systems. So when it was really cold and the oil was thick, it didn't work too well. And after a while, the engine oil attacked the bands and the clutches. It wasn't the right stuff for that. Not to mention, you had to change the oil. When you change the oil, there's a lot of oil in it then. And they recommended changing the transmission oil every 500 miles, which, yes, that didn't go over too well either. And Oldsmobile didn't have the manufacturing facilities for this, so Buick made it. Well, it had a lot of problems, and they were coming back to Buick with these problems. And Buick finally said enough of this, and so that was, after a couple of years, that went away. But they were working up to it. Finally, OK Kelly kept working with fluid couplings and torque converters. Daimler, 1930 Daimler was the first fluid coupling in a production car. It's a 30 Daimler over there, but they didn't have any synchromesh. But they did, and one of the reasons they had the fluid coupling was Edward VI was the king, and Daimlers were the official car at the palace. And Edward VI, he never liked cars, he liked horses. And he really didn't like to ride in an open car that jerked during the parade. Made him look bad. You know, the king fall out of the car, that's not too good. And that's why Daimler developed fluid couplings. They had them in royal cars way back in the 20s and beginning. They had them in ships before that. Actually, the Titanic had a fluid coupling on their third central engine, turbine engine. So they knew some about that. 1939, Chrysler came out with fluid drive. What that was a fluid coupling between the engine and the clutch. Still had a regular manual transmission, but you didn't really have to know how to use the clutch to start off. You couldn't stall the engine. I like that drawing of the 1939 Chrysler. Fluid drive cars were notorious for being slow, and all those speed lines they added to it didn't really make the car any faster. But and you still had to shift gears. You could start off in third gear and not shift, but boy, it was really slow then. And you still had to know how to use the clutch to put it in reverse and stuff. But so it was kind of an idea. It was there, creeping up on it. But it wasn't automatic. You still had to know how to use the clutch. Well, finally, 1940, Thompson and his guys put this all together. They developed the 6 elements of a hydromatic transmission, an automatic transmission, right? Fluid coupling between the engine and the gearbox, planetary gears coupled together for 4 forward speeds, hydraulic activation of clutches and bands. They developed a hydraulic analog computer, this was really a touch of genius. Nobody had done this before. But they developed a hydraulic governor that gave a increasing hydraulic pressure as the output shaft sped up. And they used other valves connected to the gas pedal to give a sense of how far down the driver had pushed the gas pedal, which opposed the fluid from the governor. So that when the governor wanted to shift up, if the gas pedal was pushed down hard, it couldn't until the car speed increased even more. I mean, people don't really think about this stuff much these days because everybody has an automatic transmission. But this was really quite the thing. It provided a gear ratio that was appropriate to what the driver needed and wanted. And in fact, if you were driving along at a light throttle and you wanted to suddenly accelerate and push the gas pedal down, it would actually overcome the governor pressure so much that the car would downshift a gear or 2 gears. Okay, again, that was another big deal, especially back in the old days. People drove on 2-lane roads a lot, and when you wanted to pass somebody, that could be kind of dicey, and having the car shift into a lower gear by itself, that helped a lot. They also developed a parking lock. In the old days, people had stick shifts, and even when I was a kid, people used to do this. They put the car in low gear, turn the engine off, and walk away. Well, if you had a fluid coupling between the engine and the transmission, the car wasn't going to stay there. So what they did, the early Hydromatic still had a sliding gear set up for reverse. And that's why when you look at, there's a big space on the shift quadrant between low and reverse, because when you move that lever, you were putting it sliding gears into engagement for reverse. So what they did was, if you wanted to, when you parked the car, you put it in reverse, and when you turned the engine off, fluid would bleed out and the intermediate band would apply, so it was in 2 gears at once. So the car would stay there. I mean, that's pretty ingenious, you know. And another thing that they finally did was they invented automatic transmission fluid. I mean, nowadays nobody even thinks about that, but all the oils they had just weren't the right kind of stuff for an automatic transmission. These guys, you know, I have become really impressed with these, just 6 guys doing this. You know, Buick didn't want to build this. They got burned by the automatic safety transmission. Enough of this stuff. So GM created a new division called the Detroit Transmission Division in Detroit. And McEwen, the Oldsmobile manager, said that Oldsmobile should have this first because, after all, he nurtured the thing and put up the money for it. They didn't know how well this was going to go over. It was like a $120 option, which is a lot of money for a $700 car. Well, much to their amazement, half of the Oldsmobile customers signed up for it. And you could get it on any Oldsmobile at first, but they just couldn't make these things fast enough. These poor guys in the Detroit Transmission Division are working night and day, 24/7, making Hydromatic transmissions. So pretty soon the Oldsmobile people said, well, if we can only get so many of these, we're going to put them on the 8-cylinder Oldsmobiles, make some more money that way. You know, there's a 1940 Oldsmobile chassis with an early Hydromatic right behind me, in fact, 1940. So Cadillac figured, well, we're a luxury car, we got to have this too. So they had it in 1941. And similarly, half the people that bought Cadillacs in 1941 signed up for Hydromatic. Now, it's interesting, when you go to a show, I've been in the Cadillac Club a long time. You look at 1941 Cadillacs these days at car shows, hardly any of them have Hydromatic. But back in the day, half of them did. You know, I suspect what happened was a lot of them might have had problems and been converted to stick shifts, or when people restored these old cars, they made them into stick shifts, or whatever. But it was a tremendous success. Right. Well, then, there's good old Hydromatic number 1. You can see the fluid coupling, hydraulic controls, and sliding gears for reverse. Well, they only did that for the first couple of years. And then they put in a set of planetary gears on a cone clutch that would engage them for reverse. Because one of the drawbacks to that early transmission was if you were still rolling or if the parts are still rotating, you try to put it in reverse, the gears would grind and make bad noises. Not a good idea. So that's pretty rare. But that was the genesis of automatic transmissions right there. It's the first time you get in the car, put the shift lever and drive away. Oldsmobile used to advertise it as the car without a clutch. You see these pictures, and they used to have old film strips they showed of the disappearing clutch. The clutch would fade away. It was really kind of cute. But it was a big deal, and it helped a lot of people drive. Well then, almost when they were just getting going, World War II comes along. And so they're trying to make all kinds of war production things. And one of the things they did was they made a light tank, light in the relative terms, and they're trying to get these things built right away. They took 2 Cadillac V8 engines with Hydromatic transmissions and put it in this tank. And it allowed them to teach people how to drive tanks a lot easier. It's hard enough driving a tank when people are shooting at you, having to figure out how to shift gears at the same time. And they were recruiting people. They're trying to make big trucks for the war effort. Well, big trucks had big truck transmissions, and that was tricky to drive. So GMC, Hydromatic, they basically took the Hydromatic transmission and just made everything about 50% bigger and put them in these GMC trucks. It made it a lot easier to teach people how to drive big trucks. That was important during the war. They're drafting people right and left. A lot of people didn't even know how to drive, period. You know. And OK Kelly went to Buick. Buick was making a tank, and he designed a torque converter transmission for Buick tanks. Didn't have any gears at all. It was a giant torque converter. They got one of these in that Buick display up in Flint, and I actually climbed up on the ladder and looked inside. You could see controls for it. You couldn't see much else. And then the docent came along and told me to get off of that. But and of course nobody there knew anything about it, the transmission. But that was a big important thing. And this went on for, World War II went on for 4 years. Our part of it went on for 4 years. Well, the war ended, and GM still wasn't really sure if Hydromatic transmission was going to be a real thing. Once the novelty of it wore off. So they actually approached other car companies to sell it to them. And the first company they went to was Hudson. And Hudson was run by a bunch of old guys. And the head of Hudson said, "We don't need that. We got the best clutch and transmission in the business." So they went on to Kaiser and Fraser and a whole bunch of other cars. And after a couple of years, people at Hudson noticed that people were buying Oldsmobiles and Kaisers with Hydromatic transmissions right and left. And they went back to Hydromatic and said, maybe we should have one. So eventually they did. They sold them to Rolls-Royce and Bentley. And they even sold them to Lincoln. Lincoln figured out pretty soon if Cadillac had a Hydromatic, they were going to have a hard time selling luxury cars without an automatic transmission. So they signed up for Hydromatic. That Lincoln, the green Lincoln out there, has a Hydromatic. It's just about the last year they used a Hydromatic in a Lincoln. But when I say Rolls-Royce and Bentley had them, a lot of cars did. Well, OK Kelly was still working at Buick, and he went on and used this torque converter knowledge that he gained making the tanks and created Dynaflow. Buicks had their own transmission, automatic transmission, Dynaflow. So until 1950, General Motors made all of the automatic transmissions in the world. That's pretty amazing, starting from this team of 6 guys to that. Well, Hydromatic had a few problems, not the least of which I didn't put any pictures of it here, but they were making Hydromatics right and left. They built this giant factory in Livonia to make Hydromatics, and things were going great. And then one day the factory burned to the ground. Yeah, That was a problem. And it was really a problem for all those other car companies that were relying on Hydromatic transmissions. That's when they basically leased and then bought the Willow Run plant out here. Relatively short time. Amazing example of industrial accomplishments. They were up and running relatively short time making Hydromatics again. And they were there for a long, long time. Huge plant. That's where I started. I started my career in 1965 as a co-op student in that factory. And there were more people working in that factory than there were in the whole town I came from. This came from a small town in New York, yeah. So it was quite a culture shock for a kid from upstate New York. But the Hydromatic had a few issues. When they shifted from second to third, they had to release a band and a clutch and engage another band and another clutch. And given that they were doing this with all mechanical and hydraulic controls, that was kind of hard to synchronize. So they were famous for having a really harsh shift from second to third. And it was the only game in town. It didn't matter, you know. You got a Hydromatic. And they had to be kept in careful adjustment to work well. Another problem was the Hydromatic had a fluid coupling, which was more efficient than a torque converter. The downside of that was you had to hold your foot on the brake harder to keep the car from creeping when you're standing at the traffic light. With a Dynaflow, had a torque converter, which was not very efficient at real low speeds, and it was much more convenient. In the beginning, low and reverse were next to each other on the Hydromatic because they needed to mechanically move the gears into reverse. Well, after a while, they didn't have to mechanically move them in, but they kept that arrangement of the shift quadrant. And other people copied it, in fact. But it's not a good idea to have low and reverse next to each other without a neutral in between. And lots of people had accidents. Basically, cars had several different arrangements of shift patterns in the early 50s, and people were always running into each other in reverse or drive. Finally, the Prindle was more or less standardized, partly because the government refused to buy any cars that didn't have that arrangement. So and then what was a little more disturbing, besides Buick, Studebaker and Packard created their own automatic transmissions. And they differed from Hydromatic in a number of important ways. Hydromatic, to try and overcome the shift quality problems, they put a second fluid coupling in. There's one of those around here too. And what that did was when you were in second and it got ready to shift into third, it would suck the oil out of that second fluid coupling, make the shift, and put the oil back in, which made the shift a lot smoother, made the whole thing a lot more complicated. And don't forget, they're doing this with no electronics or anything. This is all like hydraulic and mechanical. It made for kind of a long shift, which might be a little disconcerting, but at least it was smoother. Of course, Dynaflow had no shift quality problems at all because it never shifted. It just had a giant torque converter. It had their own set of problems. Yeah, there's a Hydromatic shift selector. That's a 52 Cadillac. Yeah, there's a Dynaflow. The original Dynaflow had a big torque converter, and basically all the drive was through the torque converter except for reverse. Or they had what they called an emergency low. I guess the emergency was when you want to outdrag some kid in a V8 Ford, you could put it low and smoke the tires in your Buick. But they kept making more and more complicated torque converters, 5-element, 7-element torque converters, the planetary gears between the elements, and all this stuff. But it was always smooth because there was never a mechanical shift. That was a trademark of Buick. When I was a kid, Buick had Dynaflows. You could always tell a Buick pulling away because the engine would rev up and stay there, and the car would speed would gradually pick up to match the engine. It was a distinctive sound, distinctive thing. Anyhow, they kept working on Dynaflows. Packard made a transmission, they called it Ultramatic. This is back when transmissions had great names. Yeah. And it was very much like a Dynaflow, except that they put a lockup clutch in the torque converter to minimize slip at higher speeds. And it improved the gas mileage significantly compared to a Buick. I mean, by today's standards, these were all pretty awful gas mileage cars. But it was a big improvement, and it was well received. Except that 55, 56, they decided they wanted to have a push-button selector, and it was electrical, and that didn't work too well. That was a constant problem for Packards at that time. Contributed to their demise. But that was quite an achievement for a small company to make their own automatic transmission. Well, Studebaker also made their own automatic transmission. They were a little short on fancy names. It's called Studebaker Automatic Drive. That's not up there with Hydromatic and Ultramatic. But this was pretty important. It used a torque converter, but it used 3 geared speeds, and it was all hydraulically controlled. So the torque converter improved the acceleration from rest. The geared speeds provided performance at all speeds. Gave you a low gear for acceleration and a high gear for cruising. And it had the automatic kick down just like a Hydromatic. And it had a lockup clutch in the torque converter to minimize slippage. So it got better mileage on highway driving. Well, this was pretty important because that basically set the pattern for automatic transmissions for the next 40-some years, maybe 50 years. The Studebaker designed this themselves. Again, quite an achievement for a small company. But they didn't have the manufacturing capability to actually make these, so they farmed it out to BorgWarner. Well, Ford saw this, and Ford figured, we got to have one of these too. And so basically, BorgWarner made these for Ford under license, and Studebaker collected part of the license fee for all these Ford transmissions for a while. And Ford came up with much better names. Fordomatic, Mercomatic. Yeah, that was Ford's big. And after a while, Ford did away with the lockup clutch and torque converter. They didn't really need that. But like I said, that was quite the achievement for Studebaker. In fact, that picture shows a great big brake pedal as big as the brake and the clutch pedal combined. So you couldn't help but notice that you had no clutch pedal. Yeah, which is actually something other companies eventually copied too. All cars are like that now, that have automatic transmissions. And again, that woman is putting it in drive and driving away, just like the woman with the 40 Oldsmobile. Well, Hydromatic wasn't going to stand around and watch other people take their market. So they basically, the dual coupling Hydromatic was a sort of another iteration of the original one. But by the mid-60s, they realized, we got to do something. This is basically outdated technology. And the management at GM realized, we had these guys down at Hydromatic that knew everything there was to know about clutches and bands and controls. And we had these guys up at Buick that knew everything there was to know about torque converters. So basically, they sent a whole bunch of guys from Buick down to Hydromatic. And this is when I started working there. Still, there was a bunch of guys down there that were still known as Buick guys. And they're always off tinkering around with torque converters. And they had their own little test things and tanks of fluid and stuff like this. And then there were the Hydromatic guys that worked with all the gears and clutches and stuff. And together, they put together the Hydromatic 400, which had elements actually from the Studebaker transmission. The same kind of Simpson gear set. Had a bunch of refinements. And it was a really outstandingly well designed and well manufactured transmission. They made that thing for years and years. They were still using them in Hummers, geez, into the 90s, maybe into 2000. It was, among the other things, they replaced the mechanical linkage from the gas pedal with a vacuum modulator and that's got a vacuum line that goes up to the carburetor, and it's measuring. It's a more accurate measurement of how hard the engine is working than just the mechanical linkage. So the transmission would shift more appropriately and wouldn't hunt back and forth between gears. It knew much better what we were trying to do. Like I say, they made this, and Buick, they put it in Buicks in 1964, and Buick called it the Buick Super Turbine 300 because they couldn't quite give up their own names for transmission. And by 65, it was in all the big GM cars. 64, some Cadillacs had it and some did not. The Fleetwood 60 Specials and the convertibles all had the Hydromatic 400, and the other cars had the older Hydromatic dual coupling, 64. But in 65, that was the end of the 4-speed Hydromatic, and they all had the Hydromatic 400. And in fact, GM copied it. Smaller versions, Hydromatic 350s, and eventually the 200 and all those. They all follow the pattern of this Hydromatic 400. And they used the internals of the 400 to make the Hydromatic 425, which was the front-wheel drive transmission. And what they did conceptually is they sawed that off just behind the torque converter. They turned the gearbox around 180 degrees, connected it with a great big chain. If you see the chain on that, there's one of those there too. The chain's about this wide, really hard to deflect. You can't just, in real life, I don't know about these models, but in real life, you couldn't push that. Yeah. And the story goes, and I was there at the time, so I heard this maybe close to firsthand, that the engineers designed a chain that was 1.5 times as strong as it could possibly be. And the management looked at it and they just said, that's way too small. So the engineers went back and designed one that was 5 times as strong as it needed to be. And everybody said, yeah, that looks better. So well, when they came out with a successor to that, the Hydromatic 325, they went back and they made it only 3 times as strong as it had to be. But needless to say, they never had any problems in chains in the field. But that had all the same mechanical parts as the 400. Come to the part of the presentation that people have been waiting for. And that is, did Lois Lane have a Hydramatic in her 1953 Rambler? In fact, her first Rambler she did not. She had a 51 Rambler. I don't know if you watched Superman on TV. Yeah, 51, that was clearly a stick shift. But in 53, her second Rambler convertible clearly had a Hydromatic. Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah, I mean, I know people in the line laying awake thinking about this topic.
George Reeves.
Yeah. Well, Superman, he never drove. He just flew. But his buddy, Inspector Henderson, had a fancy Nash Country Club. And it had a Hydromatic. Clearly had a Hydromatic. And Perry White, who was Superman's boss. Yeah, Great Caesar's Ghost. Well, he had a Cadillac in the beginning. That clearly had a Hydromatic. And that klutz, Jimmy Olsen, got in trouble, and the bad guys wound up driving the Cadillac off the cliff. You could clearly see him reaching in and pushing shift lever in the drive. I don't know how Jimmy Olsen ever kept his job. I noticed that Lois Lane never let him drive Nash. Yeah, anyhow. The Lincoln Futura, remember that?
Yep.
Later on became a Batmobile. But in the beginning, it had a Hydromatic transmission. Because it was released in 1954. And there's a movie called It Started With a Kiss. It's really an insipid movie. I mean, there's no redeeming value to this movie except watching him drive this Lincoln Futura around in Spain. You know, that's really cool. And you can see Debbie Reynolds is in it, Debbie Reynolds and Glenn Ford, and both of them drive this car. And you can clearly see him putting it in park, moving the shift lever all the way down to park the car. That's pretty cool. But by the time Batman bought it, it been refitted with a later Lincoln engine transmission, a Ford transmission. And the Godfather didn't drive. But he was driven in this Cadillac Fleetwood 75, and it had a hydromatic transmission. Again, you can clearly see his older son, I can't remember his name now, drove him a couple of times. You can clearly see him moving the shift lever to driving off. Hydromatic, Sonny. Yeah, Sonny. And yeah, Sonny came to a bad end, but clearly had a hydromatic. So you do see hydromatics in movies. You just got to watch for them. Anyhow, when you leave, take it out of the park, put it in drive, have a safe trip home.